Good afternoon. I'm Steve Shalom, the director of the Gandhian Forum for Peace and Justice here at William Patterson University, the sponsor, along with many others, of this event. Before we get going, I'd like to introduce the Provost and Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs, Warren Sandman, to offer a few words of welcome.
Good afternoon and welcome to this event. You know, one of the things that's really special about this university are the fact that we have faculty, such as Professor Shalom here, who put together these sorts of events. We have a number of groups on campus who do these sorts of things, and that's really impressive and something that really stands out about our university. But what's also special is that when we do have these events, this many people show up, and our students are engaged. They're active. As I was telling our speakers, they're not just going to be here because they have to be here for a class. They're going to be listening, and they're going to be asking questions as we go through the presentation here today. And that's something that's also impressive about our university here. Professor Shalom will tell us a little bit more about our speakers and about our topic, but this sort of event and what we'll be talking about here today is just an example of some of the things that we do trying to bring in what goes on outside of the campus to our campus. We can't pick up a newspaper or turn on the news or listen to the radio without hearing about what's going on these days in Syria and the Middle East. And to see this tragedy unfolding right now, it's kind of devastating to watch what's happening. So we need to learn a little bit more about this. We need to understand a little bit more about this process. And our speakers here today will give us that opportunity to learn a little bit more about what's happening here. So welcome to this event. Thank you for attending, and I'm sure you're going to be learning a lot today.
Thank you, Warren. Hundreds of thousands dead, 11 million people displaced, 4 million of them refugees outside the country. The conflict in Syria is one of the great tragedies of the modern age. The Gandhian Forum for Peace and Justice, an organization here at William Patterson, sees its role as helping our community understand some of the conflicts, some of the peace and justice struggles that are taking place around the world. So the question for us was, who could help us make sense of Syria? Who would be the experts? Well, one possibility was Samer Abboud, Associate Professor of International Studies at Arcadia University, who has recently written a book called Syria. And here's what some of the reviewers have said. A compelling, nuanced account of the Syrian conflict. This incisive study will be required reading for anyone who wishes to understand Syria's violent trajectory since 2010. But then another possibility was Robin Yasmin-Kassab, a media commentator, journalist, and novelist who has just co-written with Layla Al-Shami a book called Burning Country, Syrians in Revolution and War, a book about which reviewers have said poised to become the definitive book, indispensable for those who wish to know the truth about Syria. So which did we want, incisive or definitive? Well, what the hell, we decided to go for both. And so I'm delighted to say that they both agreed to be here today. Now, I should say that we also decided that it's important for us to think about one of the most dramatic ways in which the Syrian conflict affects us, and that's the refugee crisis. And so at 3:30, we're going to have a panel discussion with a bunch of participants who will address the refugee crisis, compassion, justice, and public policy. We invite you to join us for that part of the program as well. Let me note that you can buy copies of either of these books just outside the doors, and you can also register to vote, something that anyone who hopes to change public policy in this country on Syria, on refugees, or on any issue needs to do. So let me describe the format for our discussion this afternoon. First, Robin Yasmin-Kassab will speak for about 15 minutes. Then Samer Abboud will speak for the same length of time. Then I'll give them each 3 minutes to comment on each other's talks, and then we'll open it up to you, the audience, for a question and answer session. And then at the end, we'll give Samer and Robin 3 minutes each to wrap up. And now it is my pleasure to present Robin Yasmin-Kassab.
Hello, yes. It's really nice to be here. It's really nice to be in America, and it's nice to be here at Patterson. Thanks very much for inviting us, and thank you, Steve, for that lovely introduction. So, Syria. I've got 15 minutes to tell you everything about Syria, which will be easy. There's Syria in the Middle East. When you look at the news nowadays, it's all about war, displacement, refugees, terrorism, horrible, horrible things. Of course, it is a country with an enormous history and a part of the world with an enormous history. It's part of the Fertile Crescent where the first agricultural revolution happened. It's part of the area where the first writing systems were invented. So it's a place which has got a lot more to it than just war and chaos and terror. Like Iraq and Palestine and Lebanon and all of these places that we generally know for war, but they've got a lot more going on. So in my 15 minutes, I will try to talk firstly about where all this came from, how did all of this start, and then I'd like to draw your attention to some of the more positive things that Syrians have managed to achieve in very difficult circumstances in the last 5 years. Okay, so where did it all come from? Of course, it didn't start as a war, it started as a protest movement in 2011. And this protest movement then became a social revolution. And then, under enormous pressures, it militarized and it became a war. And then lots of different states got involved, and it really became very complicated indeed. And the people that started all of this became almost invisible to the outside world. We just saw the jihadists and the armed militias and so on, and we didn't see the people on the ground. How did it come about? Well, to start with, I think that any government or regime or governing system depends on two things to stay in power. And this goes not just for dictatorships in the Middle East, but also for the governing system here or in Europe or anywhere else. They depend on coercion and consensus. In other words, they use force or the threat of force to keep people in line, and they also have to win agreement or consensus from certain sections of the population. At least some people in the society have to be happy with the situation. And of course, it depends on the type of regime. I mean, in America, it's mainly consensus. The coercion, you don't usually see it. In the Middle East, you see the coercion a lot more than the consensus. But always these two things have to be in place. If one of them collapses, then the regime or government is in trouble. Bashar al-Assad is the president of Syria at the moment. He should be called the king of Syria, because the way in which he became president was he inherited power from his father when his father died. So it's a kind of republican monarchy or some kind of contradiction like that. Now, his father came to power in 1970. And his father certainly used force. He used the army and the security forces to repress dissent and to keep people scared. But also, he built consensus, he built agreement. He gave certain sections of the population something that would benefit them. So, for example, minority religious groups, first amongst them the Alawi community, which is the community that the president himself came from, they thought, right, this is great that we've got an access now into the army, into the security services. It helps us to improve our position. And of course, the Alawi community historically was somewhat oppressed and marginalized in Syria. So this was a big thing for many members of religious minorities, that they had an opportunity to come into the institutions of state and specifically the army and security services. And then the peasantry, the farmers in the countryside, not just Alawis, but also Sunnis, who are the majority, Sunni Arabs, they benefited at first from the kind of modernization programs that the Assad regime was doing, and that many different regimes throughout the area were doing in those years, whether they were monarchies or left-wing nationalists or whatever. They were electrifying the villages, building roads, and of course this was of benefit to the peasants. They could now get their crops to market and so on. The urban working classes also benefited from jobs in the rapidly growing state sector. They benefited from subsidies on food and fuel, which was a safety net for the poor. And people in general put up with the repression and the humiliation and the corruption because, you know, they were getting something out of it. They were able to feed their kids. In the year 2000, Hafiz al-Assad died and his son Bashar came to power. And at first it seemed that he was going to be a reformist. But what he tried to do was economic reforms without political reforms. He thought, if I can bring more money into the country and make people happier because they've got more money, then they'll be quiet about democracy and political rights and the freedom of the press and so on. And it really didn't work. It wouldn't have worked anyway, I think, but the other reason why it didn't work was because his neoliberal reforms were done very badly, and they were really crony capitalist reforms, so that wealth became concentrated more and more in a tiny elite. And in fact, the president's cousin, a man called Rami Makhlouf, ended up with, some people say, 60% of the economy. He had a finger in it. And the safety net for the poor that we were talking about before disappeared. The subsidies on food and fuel were taken away. The farmers and the peasants in the countryside suddenly felt that, you know, their standard of living was going down. People were getting to the stage where it was difficult to feed their children. So people were, in the years before the revolution, people were muttering, why should we put up with the humiliation and the repression when, you know, in the past we got something out of it, we're no longer getting anything out of it. That's where it came from. You can add to that lots of other factors. I mean, there was a terrible drought in Syria for several years before the revolution. As a result of that drought, lots of people, hundreds of thousands of people, left the east of the country, this area, which is almost desert. It was becoming much more like a desert. So a lot of families were giving up and they were moving to the cities in the west of Syria, to Damascus and Aleppo and Homs and places like this, and living in the suburbs where already there weren't enough services to provide for the people. So things were getting tenser and tenser. And then, of course, it came in the context of the Arab Spring, as it's known. In 2011, all over the Arab world, you had an explosion of democratic movements, protest movements, and also later we saw Islamist movements, different people suddenly, you know, expressing their discontent and wanting to have more participation in and make more decisions about their own lives. Also, when Hafiz al-Assad, the father, came to power in 1970, there were 6 million Syrians, 6 million people in Syria. By 2011, there were 23 million Syrians. So it was a very different and a very young population, and you couldn't control 23 million 21st century people in the same way that you could control 6 million 20th century people. The Syrians, despite the best efforts of the so-called Arabist regime to keep them isolated from other people through the internet and in other ways, they were more connected to other Arabs and other countries, other people, other young people around the world than they'd ever been before. So it was in this context that it broke out. And it started as a protest movement, not a revolution. The early slogans of the protest movement were things like, the Syrian people won't be humiliated. The Syrian people won't be insulted. 111, the Syrian people are one. They weren't calling for the fall of the regime or the execution of the president, these things which you heard later. Why did that come? Well, it came because the regime responded with extreme and horrific violence. And, I would say that's because Assad knew that he couldn't survive a real reform process, so he provoked a war. And Samer, I think, is going to talk about the war and the military aspect of it in a moment. So I will now talk about some of the positive things that Syrians have done. And the fundamental thing is that they started organizing themselves. This is quite remarkable in a country where for so long people felt that they just couldn't speak. There was a famous Syrian dissident called Syria a kingdom of silence. Of course, people did speak in private when in their own little group, which is in a way a very dangerous thing. If you're going to have a conversation, it's best to have it openly in public. If you're suspicious of members of another sect, for example, or members of another race, or if you're scared of them, it's probably better to talk about that publicly, to talk to those people that you're scared about and see what they think, and then you might get somewhere, you might understand each other. But people were whispering in private about the other people, which is a dangerous thing. The first kind of organisation, revolutionary organisation that was set up were the coordination committees. There's a woman, a human rights lawyer called Razan Zaytouni, who is now abducted, perhaps dead, who we dedicated our book to. My co-author Leila used to work with her in Syria before the revolution in human rights. She was one of the founders of the coordination committees, but they didn't really need a founder because they were organic things which started sprouting in each neighborhood. The coordination committees, it was just 5 or 10 people, just small groups, 5 or 10 people in each neighborhood. And their job was to organize protests, to help people who were, help the families of people who'd been arrested or killed, and to record what was happening, to record the protests, to record the violence and the repression and the killing, to try and contact the international media and show the world what was happening. Somebody called Ghaith Matar, from a suburb called Diraya, a suburb of Damascus. He was one of these early revolutionaries already, dear me. He was encouraging people to provide, to offer flowers and bottles of water to soldiers, this kind of thing. Unfortunately, he was taken away and tortured horribly to death, and his mutilated corpse was returned to his family. This is why the peaceful nature of the revolution soon changed. I've got 2 minutes to go, so very quickly I wanted to talk about the other thing, which is the councils. As the regime started losing land, as land was liberated, the people started setting up local councils. Communities organized themselves and set up local councils, and these look after, rubbish collection, education, healthcare, food distribution in the most difficult of circumstances, in places where bombs are dropping every day, where people are sometimes starving to death because of sieges. The majority of these councils are democratically elected. They're not all perfect. There are problems with some of these councils. But given that under bombs, in the most difficult of circumstances, in a country which was a cast-iron dictatorship for half a century, there are Syrians organizing themselves and organizing elections and making their own representatives, organizing their own communities. This is a miracle. And I think it's actually a kind of crime of journalism and our culture over here that we don't know anything about it. In the previous decade, in 2003, we apparently felt so strongly that the Arabs need democracy that we, in America and Britain, invaded Iraq and occupied Iraq and moved, hundreds of thousands of men and machines and spent billions and billions of dollars, supposedly, in order to bring democracy to the Arabs. Of course, it didn't work out very well. You can't bring democracy to people with tanks. They can only do it themselves. But now, today, They're doing it themselves, and we don't even know about it. Our media is telling us about head-cutting jihadists and about President Assad and about Russia and Iran and Saudi Arabia and Turkey, all of these states, but we're not paying any attention to the amazing stuff that Syrian civilians have done on the ground. It's not just councils, it's also, you know, there are well over 60 free newspapers and magazines discussing everything. There are tens of free radio stations in a country where 5 years ago there wasn't one. There are there's been an explosion of cultural production, from graffiti to hip-hop to traditional songs being revamped for revolutionary contexts. So I can say hardly anything in this short amount of time, but the one thing I would ask you to do is to try to pay attention to grassroots Syrians on the ground, what they're saying, what they're feeling, and what they're doing, because that's what is being missed from the discourse, and that's why we wrote the book. Thank you very much.
I have a 6-year-old daughter who's in first grade, and we had that parent-teacher meeting a few weeks ago, and apparently my daughter was sitting with a pen in her hand and a blank piece of paper, and the teacher came to her and said, "Sweetie, do you need any ideas? Do you have something to..." She said, no, I have lots of things to write about. I just don't think anybody will read it." It's the daughter of academics. So I want to thank you for those of you who are going to bother reading the book, because that's all we want, right, is to be read. So I appreciate it very much. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you to Steve for the wonderful invite, and to Robin for that excellent presentation. I think you set up my talk very well. Unfortunately, I don't have Robin's charisma, so I have notes, so I have to look at them. I actually want to start my talk about Syria with a quote about Lebanon. It was once said by a Canadian diplomat that if you understand Lebanon, then it was badly explained to you. And I think that that kind of sentiment really applies to the Syrian conflict. This is very complicated. It's very difficult. I think what Robin did in 18 minutes is quite fascinating, to get at some of the nuances and to point us to the kind of blind spots analytically. And so that's, in the spirit of that, that's what I'd like to do in my presentation as well, is to help you think analytically about the conflict, not just what's happened, not just its trajectory, but what might be happening in the future. Of course, at this point, it's cliche to say that the Syrian conflict is complicated, that it's multi-layered. Yes, we all know that but analytically, our goal should be to kind of try and unravel that. So instead of focusing on the councils, the coordination committees, what I want to focus on really is the question of violence. Why does the violence in Syria look the way that it does? What is the structure of violence? Why has violence proliferated? These are things that I'm quite interested in. But before I get into that, I just want to say a couple of things about, perhaps to add to what Robin said, or at least to set it up better for myself, that this period prior to the uprising is a period of remarkable socioeconomic change that happens in Syria, and Robin was really right about that. What I would add to it is that where the regime was extremely successful, and where we see the kind of effects of this later on, the regime was very successful in atomizing society and preventing different social groups from coming together and organizing, let alone mobilizing, which creates this kind of climate of mistrust, a climate of fear that carries over into the uprising period. And so when protesters are coming on the street and organizing and holding protests, a lot of that is reliant on their social networks. They have to connect to communities in which they trust, communities that will keep them safe. And what we see in the early stages of the uprising is the creation of a kind of protest movement that has a national character. If we look at the Syrian map, if we look at all major population centers, wherever there's population, there's some form of activity, even if it's these 30-second kind of flash mob protests or something like that. There are protests throughout the country, and these protests have a national character geographically. But what they don't have is a kind of national character institutionally, because there's no pre-existing political parties or unions or associations that were able to capture the protests and to coordinate them and give them meaning. So the coordination committees that arose, the local councils that arose in exceptional circumstances. I mean, it really is a miracle that these things were able to be formed inside of Syria. But what happens over time after year one, in the context of the repression of the regime, in the context of the increasing militarization, that there's tremendous pressure on these councils, tremendous pressure on these institutions, to the point where they are no longer able financially or for other reasons to provide many of the services in which the communities have been expecting from them. So when the protests break out, there are no institutions, no associations from which to mobilize. There's tremendous pressure that's placed on the councils and the committees. The external opposition that forms is completely disconnected from what's happening inside of Syria, okay? And so you basically have these vulnerable bodies that are existing in the uprising. And what we know, obviously, is the regime does not collapse. Although the regime contracts, the regime starts to withdraw and these councils take over, the regime doesn't collapse. It still exists in some sort of emasculated form. But it exists, and it exists kind of alongside the emergence of these councils, but also something called the Free Syrian Army. And I think that, I'm simplifying a process here, but I think it's fair to say that the initial violence that was enacted in the Syrian case with these brigades that called themselves part of the Free Syrian Army was political in nature. And by that, I mean that the violence was largely driven by the goals of the uprising, which were to overthrow the regime. Of course, there was opportunism. Of course, there were some other reasons. But the main drivers of the violence were in support of the original goals of the uprising. And so I think in the first 2 years, you have kind of an opposition umbrella that emerges. What Robin was talking about, the coordination committees, the councils, the external opposition, which is outside trying to advocate for certain policies, specifically intervention, and then something called the Free Syrian Army, which isn't quite an army, it's more of a kind of conglomeration of brigades. And what happens if we look at the map of Syria around 2012, you would see a kind of line from the south up to close to Aleppo, and that would be the line of kind of violent activity, where there's violence between rebels and regime forces. But then if you look in 2013, there's basically violence throughout the country. There's a massive proliferation of violence. And what happens is violence is no longer monopolized by what we called at the time the Free Syrian Army. So I was really interested in this, kind of what happens. And you see all these brigades popping up and groups fighting each other now. And it's no longer, I don't think it was ever proper or analytically useful to talk about rebel forces in the singular, because I think that they were always kind of fragmented. But now in 2013, it's especially fragmented. So, I became really interested in this idea of networks of violence, networks of solidarity and networks of violence. How do people come together and take care of themselves in the context of a conflict, but then also how do they commit violence? And what we see around 2013 is the emergence of a particular kind of pattern that has roots in the first 2 years. And I would say that there are three major nodes in these networks of violence. The first node is what we might call like a neighborhood watch group or a battalion or a company. And this is precisely what Robin was referring to in the case of the councils. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people who come together from a certain area, who know each other, who may be related, who come together in the defense of their neighborhood. And oftentimes, these groups would then form with other neighborhood groups in a brigade. That's the second node. And so the first node may be leaderless, a few people, handful, less than 10, concentrated in a small neighborhood. And then you have a brigade which controls or is active at least in a slightly larger geographic area and has a commander. And then many of these brigades, the third kind of node in the network is what we call the front. And this is a kind of coming together of all these different brigades. But what happens in Syria is that these networks of violence emerge, but they don't congeal, right? They actually grow and fragment. And the reason that I'm bringing this up and the reason why I think that this is very important is that if we listen to popular narratives about Syria, we would assume that this is an ideological war, or it's a sectarian war, or it's predominantly ideological and predominantly sectarian. And if that were the case, then we would assume that these networks would congeal around ideology, or they would congeal around a sectarian identity or something like that. But that hasn't been the case. And so what we see, especially after 2013, is violence committed, violence being driven by many different factors. I want to stop and kind of, well, I'm not going to stop, but I'll say parenthetically, a story that a Syrian business person told me once, that in 2013 they had to start laying people off, and his company had more than 2,000 employees, which may not seem like a lot in the American context, but given that 97% of Syrian enterprises had less than 10 employees, it's a huge number. And he told me that when they started laying people off, after a few weeks, he started receiving phone calls that his former employees were being kidnapped. And he realized that the people on the other end were former employees. And they would call him weeping and demanding some sort of ransom in order to survive. And I think that the pressures of the conflict, the multi-directional pressures on people, start pushing them almost into these networks of violence. So we see a lot of extortion, kidnapping, looting, fighting over checkpoints. Some of the first fights between the anti-regime groups occurred over border crossings and checkpoints in the northern part of the country. And what this does is it spreads the violence, not just geographically, okay, but it kind of makes the drivers of the conflict very material. So it's not just material drivers, not just political drivers, not just ideological or sectarian, but material as well. And out of this emerges the military and political stalemate that defines the Syrian conflict for me up until the point of the Russian intervention. And basically what happens, the reason a stalemate emerges, is that these networks of violence are strong enough to continue fighting, right? But they're not strong enough to kind of beat each other. And you have a landscape that's defined by a series of these networks fighting each other. Regional rivalries further ensured that resources get directed to the different networks to prop them up, to maintain a stalemate. Balances on the battlefield were replicated in the political arena, where major actors remained intent on a military solution. War economies, as I gave the example, incentivized and made violence necessary for security and survival. And so what we see then is an extension of the conflict away from the original goals of the uprising to something wider and broader. That's not to suggest that the uprising somehow is irrelevant now, no, but there is a kind of extension. And this occurs because the drivers of violence change dramatically. As the motivation and opportunities for violence expand, so do the number of armed militias fighting in Syria. And so it's no surprise for me that the refugee crisis worsens, gets worse and worse as there's this proliferation of violence. What's frightening, I think, for me, is to see that how civilians kind of become an important part of the battlefield because they become central to the reproduction of the armed groups, whether as targets or whether as combatants. So I've been describing kind of what's happening perhaps on the ground, but that we shouldn't ignore, of course, that the ultimate purveyor of violence in the Syrian conflict is the regime and its allies. Most Syrians today, especially in the northern areas, have been enduring, in some cases, years of siege. Years of living under siege without electricity, without water, and for me, living under the kind of most horrific form of terror in the form of barrel bombs, which are being dropped indiscriminately on civilian areas from regime helicopters. And the Russian intervention was so dramatic and had such an effect on, on the Syrian landscape that all new Syrian health facilities are now being built underground because the Russian intervention has basically wiped out the entire healthcare capacity of Syria. So it's this interplay of these forms of violence, proliferating violence driven by material needs, political needs, etc., and violence from the air that is fueling the greatest humanitarian catastrophe of the 21st century. And so, to conclude, because I only have 30 seconds left, I've been really interested, interested is perhaps not the right word, but we are telling stories about the Syrian conflict, and I think that there's going to come a point at which the larger conflict, we have to tell a story about the larger conflict, and I think that we need to take seriously how to disaggregate the conflict into the various stages that I think Robin and I have talked about, and what the conflict looks like after the Russian intervention. I'm particularly frightened about the kind of politics that might emerge after the Russian intervention, one in which the original goals of the uprising are completely suppressed and ignored, all in the name of fighting this ubiquitous terrorism. Thank you very much.
Okay, so they're each going to have a chance to respond briefly to each other.
I have an extra 10 seconds, which I don't waste talking now. Right. So much to say. I mean, I agree with all of that, really. That's great, really useful. I would just add to that, this question that people come up to me and say, I think the Syrians made a mistake when they militarized their revolution. I can't support the Syrians anymore because they decided to pick up weapons. And I understand where that's coming from, but I think that's a misconception, because the Syrians did not choose to militarize their revolution. They didn't all have a meeting, millions of people all have a meeting one day. Shall we militarize or not? Have a debate. Yes, we all vote to militarize. That's not how it happened. It was the product, actually, the local coordination committees, for example, if you look at what the statements they were publishing in 2011, 2012, they were begging people not to pick up arms. And some of the people that we interviewed for our book, they knew at the moment that they were picking up the weapons, they knew it was a mistake, but it was an inevitable mistake. It was a reactive violence. Now, this doesn't go for everybody, because, for example, Jabhat al-Nusra, the Al-Qaeda group, and the people who came before the Islamic State, all of these people, of course, they wanted violence. They wanted it to break out because it gave them an opportunity. But for most people, it was the product of a million individual decisions made under fire. And just to remember that the regime wasn't just shooting dead protesters in the streets. It also led an organized mass rape campaign. Now, this is in a society which is conservative and religious, and where a woman's honor is sometimes considered to be more important than life itself. But I'm sure even in New Jersey, if the government decided to do an organized rape campaign, there would be very quickly, people would think, I have to find a weapon and defend myself. I have to defend my children and my wife and my mother. They were picking up children like Hamza al-Khatib, a famous 13-year-old, and torturing them to death And then usually when a fascist regime tortures somebody to death, they just bury the body and say he hung himself in custody and that's the end of the story. But they were actually giving the bodies back to the parents. Why did they do this? They did it on a mass scale. They did it to provoke the violence, because they decided that they could win a war. They couldn't win against a democratic, peaceful protest movement, but they thought they could win a war. And to an extent, they're right, because they got international backers came in. And then finally, I'll just say, because I should finish, but finally, the other thing is when you order soldiers who have joined the army for a career or because they believe that they might be defending their country against an external aggressor, when you order them day after day after day to shoot down their own countrymen and women, it's inevitable that some of those people are going to say, look, the decent ones are going to say, I cannot do this anymore. I'm going to wait for the first opportunity, and then I'm going to take my gun and I'm going to run. And then those people and their families were hunted down. They couldn't just go home and keep out of it. They really had no choice but to either kill themselves or live as guerrilla fighters. So that's where it came. It was a deliberate provocation. I don't think Assad expected the challenge to grow to be the size that it is. He has, in effect, lost control because the Assad regime, as it was in 2011, this very centralized top-down thing, no longer exists. The decisions are now being made by Russia, Iran, and local warlords as much as by the Assad regime. So they haven't really won, but Syria has been destroyed, and the great potential that we had in 2011, 2012, it seems very difficult to know how we're going to get back there. But there are still hundreds of thousands or maybe millions of Syrians, a lot of them in exile, who still have these very positive, progressive, democratic ideas in their heads, and they're waiting for a moment for it to be safe, and then they want to go back and start again. So let's see what happens in 10 years.
I actually also share Robin's optimism about the future. If not, maybe now this kind of post-Russian intervention period, I think, has been successful in terms of suffocating the rebel groups, the armed groups. But I saw recently, the Aleppo Provincial Council was meeting in a tent on the Turkish border, which gives you a sense of the decline of the embeddedness of the councils throughout Syria. One of the things that I think, I live in Philadelphia, and so I'm obviously very familiar with the media and the American media, and the narratives that we're subject to. And I think that one of the things that is very problematic about the way in which we speak about the Syrian the Syrian revolution is that we speak about it in almost identical terms to that of the regime and its supporters, that we see it as this kind of, there's a regime and there's rebels, and this word moderate makes me want to throw up in my mouth when I hear it, because I hear it so often. I've never heard anybody define what moderate means, all right? My joke is always that is it the size of somebody's beard? This is the debate here, wasn't it, right? That we have to find the moderate rebels, and people went around trying to find moderate rebels. And it was absolutely absurd. And it was an absolutely absurd and silly way to see the conflict, because ultimately what's happened in the United States, both in terms of popular narratives and in terms of policy, is that we've replicated the Russian position. We've totally replicated the Russian position. We've adopted in so many ways the narratives. And in doing so, I think that we've rendered not just invisible, but irrelevant, the kinds of agents and actors that Robin was talking about that still continue to exist. I mean, there's no point in kind of trying to build a time machine and go back and fix it, but it's silly to think that there wasn't a way in which this conflict could have taken a different trajectory, despite the problems that I highlighted, that Robin highlighted, of the institutional linkages between the councils, money issues, trust issues, capacity issues, those things which did exist. So I'm not saying this to romanticize what was happening inside of Syria, but just to suggest in a kind of very simple way that this idea that it's a conflict between a regime and some rebels, there's ISIS, there's Nusra, and then rebels in the singular, is very problematic. And it's analytically misguided, sorry, and it's informing very poor policy choices. So I think that moving forward, we really have to pay attention to, I like that language of the kind of visibility and invisibility of the people who started the revolution. That sentiment, I think, is still very strong in Syria and needs to be taken seriously moving forward.
Okay, so now I'd like to open it up to questions. Yeah.
I got a question for you. Being in the military and doing 2 tours to the Middle East, do you believe that a lot of the conflicts that are not only occurring in Syria today, but also Iraq and Afghanistan stem back to when we invaded in 1950 and overthrew the prime minister that was in charge because he wanted to nationalize oil for his country, and they had their own form of government, but we overthrew the prime minister and then took over the oil fields. Do you believe a lot of what's going on today stems from that?
Okay. My doctoral advisor, who is Iraqi, always used to walk around scratching his head, saying, "Why won't they leave us alone?" And so I think absolutely in terms of, look, if you look at the history of Iraq, I mean, you're referring to Iran and Mossadegh and the nationalization of the oil, and then Iraq with the yes. If you look at the history of Iraq. Right? I mean, it's been one American intervention after another, one form of American intervention after another for more than a generation, and to think that there has been any kind of success brought by any of those interventions from the perspective of Iraqis is, I think, problematic. I mean, just look at some of the evidence. Do I think that intervention has dramatically shaped the nature of conflict in these countries? Absolutely. I think that military intervention has played a big role, forms of legal intervention, sanctions, right? I mean, sanctions destroyed Iraq. What happened in the 90s was just as horrific as what happened prior to and after. There are other ways in which, I mean, the establishment of a sectarian political system in Iraq after the American occupation in 2003 is another example of a kind of form of intervention. And so I think that, in any case where any community or any group of people is denied the right to participate in decision-making about its future, then I can't imagine that future would evolve in a kind of healthy, natural, normal manner. So the quick answer to your question is yes, absolutely. And I would say, maybe as a footnote to that if we think that our only option in the United States is to militarily intervene or not militarily intervene in a place, to kind of go all in, right? Bet all the chips or bet none of the chips, then I think that's a kind of failure of imagination, right? There are lots of other things that could be done to, in terms of foreign policy or in terms of engagement with other places. So, thank you for the question.
Yeah, I mean, I'd just add to that I think imperialism in general is a big problem. The British and it depends where you want to go back to. You can find causes 1,000 years ago for what's happening in the Middle East at the moment. It depends at what point you want to start your narrative. The British and the French carved up that area and created countries which, they drew the borders, the local people didn't. They usually drew the borders against the wishes of the local people, and then they involved themselves in sectarian engineering where they would put one community, a minority usually, in charge of another community. It was kind of designed to fail. So you can blame the British and the French. Then America took over as the foremost imperialist power in the Middle East. I know that Americans at home believe in democracy and freedom and kind of good values, but any state, when it's interfering in other people's business, usually isn't interested in the people, doesn't have the people's interests at heart. I would say that, also at the moment in Syria, I think American imperialism is a problem, but it's not as big a problem as Russian imperialism or even Iranian imperialism, which we're not used to thinking about in the West. But the Iranians are not Arabs, they speak a different language, and they're Shia Muslims, and in the majority in Syria is Sunni Muslims, and the Iranians have tens of thousands of troops on the ground fighting for Assad. I think that everybody should keep out. America should keep out. I think it's not keeping out at the moment because it's interfering. I mean, it's vetoing other powers that want to give anti-aircraft weapons to the Free Army, for example. If the Free Army had had anti-aircraft weapons, Assad wouldn't have been able to do his scorched earth, and you wouldn't have had millions of people leaving the country and then international jihadists coming into the vacuum. Obama also, you know, the Iraqi elections in 2010, the Iraqis actually, more Iraqis voted against sectarian parties. Ayad Alawi's bloc won 2 seats more than Malki's bloc, but because Obama wanted to hand Iraq over to Iran's sphere of influence, he sent his ambassador Chris Hill to pressure Alawi to accept that he'd lost the election even though he'd won. If Alawi had won, it's not sure or it's unlikely that ISIS would have come into the Sunni Arab areas, and you wouldn't have had to have American planes bombing Iraq again now. So yeah, it's a mess. It's a terrible mess. I think if America wants to do something, it should just either allow people in the area to do what they want to do and just keep completely out of it, or it should use its influence much more than it's been doing to pressure other states like Iran and Russia to keep out. And unfortunately, Obama's idea of diplomacy is to kind of appease these powers and to do deals with these powers at the very moment where they're creating enormous problems.
Let me get the person, yeah, behind, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So we all know there's a lot of violence happening in Syria, such as beheading, jihadists, and all that stuff. So my question is, what kind of people are mostly targeted?
The people are mostly targeted, well, of the jihadists.
Okay. So, someone should repeat the question because I can't hear it in the back. Do you want me to?
Sure, go for it.
Okay, so the question was, who have been the victims of the beheadings and the torture and the violence that we hear about?
If you're talking about the violence in general, then I would say that, maybe 97%, it seems that some studies say 97% of the people killed have been killed by the Syrian regime. So by far the greatest, the only force until recently with an air force was the Assad regime. And it's aerial bombardment which is killing most people and making most people leave. So rebellious areas which slipped out of regime control or which were not loyal to the regime, these areas have suffered terribly. They've suffered starvation sieges, aerial bombardment, and so on. When you bring the jihadists into the picture, everybody's suffered. ISIS has attacked the Kurds in the city of Kobani. Most obviously, the battle for Kobani destroyed that. In the end, they were pushed out, but they destroyed the city. Free army groups and Islamic Front groups, which are in the opposition, these people have also been attacked. Activists, opposition activists, journalists have all been attacked by ISIS, sometimes by Jabhat al-Nusra, which is the Al-Qaeda franchise. The Shaitat tribe in the east of Syria rose up against ISIS control, and 700 people were killed in one go, and then another 200 people from the same tribe later. So they lost 900 people fighting ISIS, killed them. And then, of course, when ISIS has captured Assad regime military bases, usually they fight the Free Army and they don't fight the Assad regime, but there are times when they have fought the Assad regime, and on one occasion they executed over 240 or something Assad soldiers. They lined them up and killed them, which is a terrible crime. I mean, I want those soldiers to lose battles, not to ISIS. I want them to lose battles to the Free Army. But I think even the opposition, the Free Army, recognise that most of those soldiers are just poor, innocent boys that have been rounded up and conscripted. They're not the criminals, once they've been defeated, they should be, exchanged in a prisoner exchange or whatever, or treated humanely. They shouldn't be executed. So everybody, all communities, and then the Alawi community, the poor Alawi community that's been made complicit in this, has lost so many of its young men fighting this hopeless war. And in many cases, those Alawis, they know that President Assad is a criminal and that he's destroying the country and that he's making it impossible for their children to live with the children of their neighbours. But because they've been so scared and because they see the Islamic State and because they fear revenge, the Sunnis taking revenge on them, and for all of these reasons, they feel they have no other option but to stick with Assad. So it's a tragedy for everybody, for every community.
Yeah.
Do you want to comment?
That was a great answer, because I think that we have to resist the temptation to offer sectarian explanations for everything that happens in Syria. So we have to resist that temptation, but also take sectarianism seriously when it needs to be taken seriously. And I think that one of the strategies of the armed groups is to basically eliminate any opposition to it, regardless of its ethnic or religious background. Is some of the violence couched in sectarian terms? Absolutely. But is it committed in the name of sectarianism? I certainly don't think so. And I think that if we look at just the barrel bombs that are being dropped, I mean, now that are probably close to 7,000 documented barrel bombs being dropped from helicopters. These are entirely civilian areas outside of formal regime control. And that, as Robin suggested, is the main form of violence and death that people are experiencing. The beheadings and the executions, that's meant for our consumption. And I think it feeds into a particular narrative. And of course, it's horrific. And of course, any loss of life, regardless of who the person is unfortunate, especially under those circumstances. But I think that is a kind of spectacular form of violence that encourages us to think in particular ways about the conflict that again is consistent, I think, with the regime and the Russian and the Iranian narratives of the conflict now. Oh, thank you.
I'm sorry. I want to say I a little bit disagree. I mean, I see they mostly targeted certain race, like the Christians, not really, I mean, overall. But I mean, if we check out, let's say, the 21 Coptics out in Libya, I feel like it's one race they focus on, especially because they don't fight their Sharia law. I just want to know, like, do they have like a mission goal, and what's the reason?
Okay, so let me just say it to the. Okay, so the follow-up question was, it seems like Christians in particular have been targeted.
It is definitely true that there's been horrific violence against Christians by jihadist groups. That's definitely true, and it's an international problem. I mean, recently we saw in Pakistan, in Lahore, where, you know, a park which I know, I've been to Pakistan several times, Christian women and children were celebrating Easter in a park, and some barbarian came and blew himself up near them and killed tens of them. I mean, there's a crisis, you know, a cultural crisis in the Muslim world at the moment, and a whole lot of political crises coming together, and people are exploiting this. And there is, in some people's brains, there is some savage sectarian nonsense going on. That's undoubtedly true. Having said that, firstly, the Christians are not a race in the Middle East. You know, the Christians are Arabs and Berbers, and they're the same race as their neighbours. They speak the same language, they look the same, they eat the same food, and usually throughout history they've been living together more or less. You know, they've been coexisting pretty well. At moments of political crisis, then this sectarian thing comes to the fore. So I think it's a simplification. Certainly, the Islamic State, for example, yes, it's declared intent is to conquer the entire world, not just the Middle East. Its declared intent is to conquer America and Britain and China and everywhere, and to fly its black flag and to eliminate everybody that isn't a Muslim, that won't convert to Islam. Yeah, that's what these mad people think. They are not representative. You know, I think even under the traumatized conditions that the Arab world is in at the moment, or the Muslim world is in at the moment, it's a very, 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 very small proportion of the population that has any sympathy for these people. It's chaos which allows them to get a foothold. So you see that wherever there is a state failure, wherever there's a power vacuum, wherever there's violence, they will turn up in Mali, in Africa. They turned up in Mali, and then they got rid of them from Mali. And then they turned up in Libya, because the Libyan regime, thank God, collapsed, but it was followed by a chaos, so they came in to exploit the chaos. They exploited the dysfunction of the post-occupation Iraqi state, and they're exploiting the chaos and the terror and the turmoil of Syria. So anywhere where there is a chaos, these people will move in. But we mustn't give them we mustn't do them the favour of taking their rhetoric too seriously. I mean, it's true that life for Christians in the Middle East has become much more difficult in recent decades, and it's becoming more scary for everybody, but also, especially for religious minorities. We must recognise that, but at the same time, we mustn't have this idea that one race, the Muslims, are against another race, the Christians, because the usual story is that the people work together, eat together, they're friends, they go out to pubs and clubs and bars, and maybe not religious Muslims in bars, they go to coffee shops together. It's normal life, just like here in New Jersey, where, yes, there are issues between different races, different religious communities, but there's a lot more going on than that. There's a lot more going on than that. There's also intermarriage and friendship and people working together. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Hi. I had a question, slight question about, well, I wanted to elaborate on one point that you said. There is conflict with the Christians, with groups like ISIS and other groups, there is also conflicts with the Muslims. They're being targeted as not equal. Well, they're being targeted as well, because if they don't believe the rhetoric of whatever, whoever is against the rhetoric of ISIS is an enemy to them. So they're being killed. They don't really choose who they want to kill. They just kill whoever's in their way. And then other than with the question was the United States. If the United States had a hand in the situation with what happened with Syria, why does the United States have this defense, and with the media right now, they don't want to help out the refugees when they sort of started the problem?
Good question.
Okay, so the question was, if the United States has been involved in various ways in Syria, why don't they want to help out the refugees from Syria?
History will look. We should be ashamed of ourselves, and it really, it's. I'm sorry. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, we.
But we will talk about this more at 3:30 when we talk about the refugee crisis in particular.
It is. You can almost absolve the administration of responsibility for not wanting to involve itself militarily or politically. I think you could probably make that case. But to absolve it of its humanitarian responsibility, or to absolve the international community, we have sunk so low as I don't even want to call it the international community. We've sunk so low that the dominant European response now is to pay off Turkey to keep refugees there. That's how low we've sunk. That we have, I mean, I'm sorry, there are just really no words to describe how I feel about this. But I will say that if there was some creative thinking, imaginative thinking, if you look at what Syrian organizations, a lot of Syrian organizations are doing, for example, ones that are working in the health sector, they're buying gauze, paying salaries, moving needles in and out so that people could get a blood things like this. Like, why didn't we send a dialysis machine or an MRI or gauze or doctors or money to pay salaries? This isn't interesting, right? It's not interesting humanitarian work, and it doesn't look good. And this is one of the major failings of the international community, is that they haven't actually looked at a lot of the invisible spots that are happening inside of Syria, or a lot of the invisible spots in Syria. There are entire areas that have been living for years under siege that don't have anything. I mean, we could have brought to bear political pressure. We could have. The United States could have. The Europeans could have. But the dominant response is to keep the refugees away. That is so silly and absurd. Are there resources being delivered to Syrian organizations? No. You know why? Because in 2011, 12, and 13, international agencies were telling Syrian organizations that you're not registered charities, you're not registered NGOs, and we can't give you money. Like, who are they going to register with, right? I heard stories about people requesting like passports, the passports of Syrian aid workers. So you have these people who are willing to put their lives on the line to get food, to get medicine, to at least prop up society in some way. And everyone is basically turning their backs on them. And that's continued. And so if we want to absolve the administration of its political positions in Syria, whatever, that's fine. But we can't absolve the administration or the European Union or anybody else for their total failure on the humanitarian catastrophe.
Okay, so we have 6 minutes left, and I did promise the two speakers 3 minutes to each summarize. No, Samir, just you go first.
Okay. I think, to summarize, I'll start with the refugee question. We have to reject explanations of the Syrian conflict. We have to reject understanding the Syrian conflict in these very simplistic terms, in terms of regime and rebel. At the same time, regime and rebels. At the same time, we have to reject simple formulas for the resolution of this conflict, especially formulas that come from Moscow or Iran or from the regime itself. We have to think on multiple fronts. We have to think in terms of the generational response. That means taking the refugee crisis seriously. It means taking the humanitarian crisis seriously. And it also means thinking about how to disincentivize conflict, how to bring people, these kind of networks that I was talking about, how to pay salaries, how to encourage people to demobilize, because ultimately, at the end of the day, I think that the majority of Syrians, all Syrians, I think, with the exception of a small minority, simply at this point want to live in their country without barrel bombs, without beheadings, without these sorts of things, and it's incumbent on us to think about how a situation can be created that makes that possible.
Thank you.
And I'll just, because we were on refugees, I'll just finish by talking about that. There was a guy called Ibrahim Qashoush in the city of Hama in 2011 who made a revolutionary song called "Get Out Bashar." And if you look up Ibrahim Qashoush revolutionary debke on YouTube, you'll see a huge crowd singing along with him. And you see the English translation underneath, and it's a kind of carnivalesque moment. It's one of those beautiful moments in the revolution. He sang this song, "Get Out Bashar." What happened to Ibrahim Qashoush? Well, shortly after that, his corpse was found in the Orontes River with his vocal cords ripped out. You sing a song against our boss, we'll rip your vocal cords out. Like the famous cartoonist Ali Farzad, who's internationally recognized when he drew a picture of a recognizable Bashar, they picked him up and broke his fingers. You use your fingers for drawing that kind of thing, we'll break them for you. Anyway, Qashush sang Get Out Bashar, and Bashar didn't get out. So now the result is that almost the entire country is trying to get out. There are 12 million people homeless. Most of those are inside Syria. They're living in other people's homes or in destroyed buildings or under bushes or in horrible camps without any international aid inside the country because it costs money. You know, it's only the richer Syrians that can actually get across the border. You need to pay somebody to smuggle you through past the checkpoints and over the border. And the borders nowadays are usually closed. So it's an absolute disaster. It's a huge, enormous tragedy which will have security ramifications for the whole world, for Europe first. And it's a problem which needs to be solved at the source. It needs to be solved at the source because the solution isn't that 23 million Syrians leave and go somewhere else. That can't work for long. President Putin, this is actually part of his deliberate strategy. You know, President Putin, is, with his carpet bombing, is deliberately making hundreds of thousands of new refugees. Many of them are heading towards Europe. At the same time, Putin is funding extreme right-wing anti-immigrant political parties all over Europe. He's hoping that the Schengen zone, which is the European Union's crowning achievement since the Second World War, this free trade area which also has a free movement of people, he's hoping that he will be able to collapse this year before his own economy probably goes bust next year. And it may well work because everybody wants to put the borders back up because they're scared of Syrian migrants. The Europeans are dealing with it very badly. I must say that they've got a bit more of an excuse for dealing with it badly than the Americans have, because it's true that there are a lot of Islamic fundamentalists in Europe. It's true that Europe is being subjected to terrorist attacks, so is America, but Europe much more. So there are genuine reasons to worry, you know. I don't think they're dealing with it well. I find it hard to understand how Ben Carson, who's a black man, you know, he was a Republican candidate, wasn't he?
Yeah.
He could, after the Paris attacks, the bombs in Paris, which no Syrian refugee was involved in, he used that as an opportunity to describe Syrian refugees as rabid dogs. And we've seen presidential candidates saying they're going to stop any Muslim coming to America. And I don't quite understand why, because it's not such a crisis here, because you are a nation of immigrants, firstly. You've got lots of space. And secondly, there aren't millions of Syrians crossing the Atlantic Ocean in boats to get here. That's happening in Europe, so it's very scary. I'd just like to say in conclusion that these are human beings. And they're not just human beings to feel sorry for. Many of them are truly remarkable human beings. This is an age of revolutions. It's also an age of savage counter-revolution. It's messy. And those of us in the West who haven't seen revolutions since, you know, in decades and decades and decades don't quite recognize how wonderful and amazing this is. The fact that people can organize themselves and hold elections and create newspapers and radio stations and debate about everything in a situation where they are dying and there are bombs falling on them and they're being starved. This is remarkable. We should be learning lessons from these people, not feeling sorry for them, and certainly not cursing them and calling them rabid dogs. Thank you very much for having us.